Linguistics Behind the Scenes.
What you always wanted to know about language and how to explore it.
With Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer.
And Dominic Piazza. Hi, Christina.
Hi, Dominic. Great to be back.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And actually, I'm back in more ways than one. I just got back from a vacation to Rome. And well, last time we were talking about history in Europe and old architecture. Yeah, Rome is a great place for that. But while I was there, I had some downtime and I saw a new Marvel movie. I'm quite a fan.
Ooh, excellent.
Do you like comic books? Do you like superheroes?
Oh, I love comics. I also like superheroes, but I think I'm actually more into the kind of traditional comic books and also cartoons. But I also like some superheroes like Superman.
Oh, you like Superman. Very nice. Very nice. So more of a DC person, maybe, you know, DC versus Marvel. Yeah, I like DC. I like Batman, but I'm probably more of a Marvel fan. Maybe if I really had to pick a favorite, I think it might be Spider-Man.
Oh, I really like Spider-Man too.
And did you grow up reading comic books?
Yeah, I grew up reading comic books and going to the library every week to get as many comic books as I could. I was only allowed to borrow 7 comic books, which was not very much for me at the time. And I actually already started reading them on the way home.
All right. Yeah, I mean, comics today are absolutely like part of our mainstream culture, right? I mean, especially with the dominance of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's, I'd say, totally acceptable and celebrated today to enjoy comic books and comic book heroes. But in the past, maybe there was a bit of a stigma. It wasn't so accepted.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, if you think about Germany in the 1950s or 1960s, people were very critical of comic books at the time. They thought that they were harmful to children, that they would make them dumb, you know, with, with that deficient language in the comic books and things like that. But now I would say that, comics are very widely accepted in Germany as well. And we have huge events like the Comic Salon in Erlangen every 2 years, where people from, I would say, all over the world meet to get an idea of the latest comic books. And there's also prizes for comic artists and things like that. It's a wonderful event, and I can very strongly recommend going there.
Oh, yes. Comic book conventions are incredible. Of course, in the US, we have the San Diego Comic-Con and the New York Comic-Con. Yeah. But also in Germany, you have the biggest gaming and comic convention in the entire world, which is Gamescom. It's held every single year in Cologne. I have been there. It's amazing. The convention center is so massive. It's like the size of a city, and there are so many attendees. I think like hundreds of thousands of attendees. It looks like ants almost. So clearly today it's huge, and it's really, really wonderful to see, especially for those of us who have been fans of these properties since we were young.
So Dominic, what kind of comics do you prefer?
Well, for the most part, I've probably read Japanese comics known as manga, quite famous around the world, and manga are then often adapted into anime, Japanese cartoons, and actually I think almost all anime are adapted from manga. And the interesting thing about manga is that because Japanese traditionally is written in the opposite direction of Western languages like English, German, French, Italian, Spanish, when these Japanese comic books are translated into other languages like English, they preserve this opposite orientation of the book, which is to say that when you pick up a manga, you open the book the opposite way, the back is the front, and you read it in the kind of the opposite direction, so to speak, of like an English language, Western language comic book. And I think it gives it a really unique, kind of strange look.
That's so cool. I mean, I'm not so much into manga, so I know more about the traditional comics, like the Belgian ones. But like Franco-Belgian school. So Tintin, Asterix and Obelix, for example.
Obelix, yeah.
And of course, I'm a huge Disney comic fan, I have to say. But these all follow the kind of standard reading direction you would expect. So what's that like in a manga? So you open it at the back, and then you kind of, if you've got text on a page, where do you start? So does that go from right to left then, and bottom up, or how does that work on the page?
Yeah, in terms of the direction of your eyes, right? Because comics, you have to look at the images kind of in a certain order as the story is told. Yeah, it also goes in the opposite direction. But when you read manga, you get used to it. And Japanese comic books are full of onomatopoeia, which I think is a hallmark of comics, right? Bam, boom, wham, pow.
Definitely.
In Western comics as well, I really, really like onomatopoeia.
Me too. I think onomatopoeia are beautiful. And in comics, I mean, very often they're even written in a way that represents the idea. When you've got a WHAM, very often it's in huge capitals that are possibly even red and yellow, and you have a bold line around it. So yeah, it's quite nice how onomatopoeia represents sounds in comics. But then, of course, it's necessary, because otherwise, how should you represent them, you know? The surrounding landscape is represented visually, and of course the text is usually in speech bubbles, but what do you do with those sounds otherwise? I think it's great, because otherwise everything would be silent in comics.
Oh yeah. Onomatopoeia are very important to comic books because, well, it's a book, it's silent. You need to have some way of kind of visually and textually illustrating the different sounds going on to the reader. And onomatopoeia across different languages are really fascinating. We have lots of words in the English language and others which are imitative, right? They imitate real world sounds, so it goes back quite a bit. In Japanese, they're very famous for having an extremely large repertoire of hundreds of onomatopoeia, even representing things that don't make any particular sound at all. But
like?
Christina, oh my gosh. I mean, they have onomatopoeia for like the concept of silence, which silence is silent. It doesn't make a sound. Or onomatopoeia for something being fluffy, or for a surface being smooth. These are concepts, not really sounds. And my gosh, they have so many. It's really incredible. It's an incredible kind of unique function of the Japanese language. But Christina, how does onomatopoeia compare in German, for example?
Well, in German, we also have onomatopoeia. I mean, we have onomatopoeia like, for example, klatschen, which means to clap, you know. I think it sounds a bit like the noise that you make when you clap. Or, for example, we have got klappern, which means to rattle. But there's also others, for example, like hachi. I mean, like when we sneeze, we say hachi. In English, it's achoo,
Achoo.
which is nice because it's a bit different, isn't it? So that's conventionalized. That's something very interesting, I think. You might believe that onomatopoeia should be the same in all languages, but then they aren't, which is very interesting, for example, when it comes to the kinds of sound that animals make. For example, in German, if you have a cock or a rooster making some noise, they're going to say kikeriki. What would you say to that?
Cock-a-doodle-doo.
Which is so different, isn't it? And one that I really don't know, like in German, if you have a bee, it goes like sum sum.
Yeah.
What noise does a bee make in English?
Bzz, bzz.
Oh yeah, right. Like a bee and then many Zs in one row, right?
Yes, it's buzzing. Yeah. Which I would think the word buzz is also imitative. I would think so. Yeah.
I would think so too. And it's quite interesting. I mean, in comics, you very often have a sequence of the letter Z or Z that expresses this idea of snoring.
That's right. Of sleeping. That's right.
But I mean, if people snore, it doesn't sound like zzz at all.
It doesn't. It does. And then we have a phrase which is to catch some Z's. Right? To catch some Z's is to get some sleep. So,
I didn't know that.
But certainly I would think that came from this visual convention of using Z's to represent sleeping. So yeah, it came full circle in a way.
That's so sweet. I love that when things come full circle and in the end you have a new construction in the language.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And Christina, you kind of took the words right out of my mouth when you brought up animal sounds, because I love animal sounds and comparing them across different languages, how different groups of people around the world can hear the same animal, make the same sound, but then represent it differently, right? So for example, the cat, right? To me, a cat goes meow. In many languages, it's meow or something to that effect. In Japanese, it's nyan. Huh?
Aww,
quite a bit different.
That's so cute.
Or when a dog barks, I would say it goes woof, woof.
In German it says wow, wow.
Ah, that's quite different. That's quite different.
Yeah. And in Spanish, it's guau guau.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. In Japanese, it's wan wan.
Oh, I like that. Sounds similar to the cat sound, though.
Almost in a way. Yeah, almost in a way.
Wasn't that nan nan?
Nyan nyan.
Nyan nyan.
Yeah.
Nyan nyan and wan wan.
Yeah.
Interesting. It seems to create a kind of proximity between the animals.
Oh, that's a good theory. That's a good theory. Well, I would at least hope that the cow can unify us all, right? The cow goes moo, right?
Yeah, I think so. In German, it's also mu. I mean, as far as I know, it should be mu in many languages.
Thank goodness.
But, yeah, that's the fun thing about the onomatopoeia, that you would believe it's the same in different languages, but it's not. It's just a matter of convention, like everything else in language. It's closer to the kind of real thing that you observe in the world. But even so, there is this kind of conventionalization that is so important throughout language. And so that also means that with regard to comics, you will have different kinds of onomatopoeia in comics from different languages. And I mean, we talked about the superhero comics earlier. So obviously, United States in English. But then there is this very, very strong tradition, of course, to have comics in French, from France, from Belgium, for example. So there's Asterix and Obelix. I don't know if they're famous in the United States as well. Are they?
Sadly, I wouldn't say so. I know about them because I learned about them in French class. But if it weren't for French class, I don't think I've ever seen them anywhere.
That's very interesting. Like for me, from a European perspective, I mean, they're everywhere. You can't imagine comics without Asterix and Obelix somehow. But of course, there's many more. There's also Spirou and Fantasio, for example, in France. That's a Masupilami, which is that's an interesting little animal from Colombia, which is a made-up country in Southern America. And there's so many different comics. I mean, I can't mention them all here, but probably it's also interesting for you to know that in spite of the criticism regarding comics in Germany, I mean, in the meantime, we have a vibrant comic scene. And for example, slightly older comics, we have the Ottifanten by famous comedian Otto Walkes, which I enjoyed reading very much as a child. And we have famous comic artists like Flix, for example, who produces wonderful graphic novels and also very, very funny cartoony stuff. It's fantastic. And Joscha Sauer, one of my favorite cartoonists. So there's plenty of interesting things in German too.
Oh, very nice. I'm so happy to hear that because, European comics are mostly a gap in my knowledge for the most part. Of course, American comics we associate mostly with superheroes, but it's not just superheroes. I'm a very big fan of Calvin and Hobbes, for example.
I love them.
I know, so cute, so cute. And even with the rise of the internet, gave rise to the web comic, right? A brand new form of comics. So XKCD.
Oh, I love XKCD.
Everyone, there's an XKCD for everything, as they say.
Yes, and there's also XKCDs about linguistics. I actually have a beautiful XKCD comic hanging on my office door. It's about linguistics, about the Tower of Babel. And you have different people who build this tower, and then God wants to make them a present because they built that beautiful tower, and asks them, I mean, what kind of things do you actually like about the world? And then one of them says, words are actually quite cool. Ooh. And then God says, oh, great. I'm going to give you many, many different languages with different grammars, different words. And then the others go like, oh no, we should not have brought a linguist. And I really like that one, for example.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. I love that. I'm happy to hear that. Yeah, comics, we think of them as a very visual medium because they're full of art, a lot of artwork. But of course, we shouldn't forget they're also full of tons of text, not just the onomatopoeia, but the dialogue, which is a very, very crucial part of comic books. And so because they're full of all of this text and language, that means that we can study them from a linguistic perspective. So when it comes to the text itself, it seems to me the American convention is to write the dialogue and the text in all caps. I thought maybe this was for legibility, that it's easier to read something written in all caps, but apparently that might not be so. Maybe it's because it looks punchy and it grabs your attention.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's studies out there showing that it's actually easier to read texts when they are in lowercase mixed with uppercase. But if you think about the early comics, I mean, they started off as comic strips, as cartoons in newspapers. And I mean, the paper quality was not so good. So that is sometimes used as an explanation why it kind of started in all caps. But I also have the impression that the traditions differ here. If I'm not mistaken, I think French comics sometimes also use all caps, but in any case, they use hand lettering, whereas in German comics, we just use printed fonts mixing upper and lower case, just as you would find them in any kind of other book. And of course, that changes the kind of quality, the visual quality of the comic as well.
Oh, okay. Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. And certainly evidence to that effect of that perhaps it's easier to read a mix of lowercase and uppercase letters is that, well, like most languages, a lot of the kind of standardized conventions came about with the advent of the printing press and kind of mass media, printed material. And I read somewhere that the German convention of capitalizing all of the nouns, which to English speakers and probably French speakers and Spanish speakers look quite strange, but the German convention of capitalizing all the nouns came about with the printing press, that printers at the time thought that when you capitalize all the nouns, it enhances the legibility.
Yeah, could be. But the interesting thing is that they did the same thing with English, if I'm not mistaken. And then actually they got rid of that again in English, but it remained in German.
Yeah, that would certainly seem so to me. Like every good U.S. history student, I've read the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, written in the 18th century, of course, and they capitalize all the nouns, and it looks really, really bizarre to modern eyes. So I think you're right.
Yeah, and I mean, in German, they also capitalized other words apart from the nouns. But in the end, it seems that the nouns are the ones that remained. And that kind of characterizes present-day German, you know? But yeah, so, I mean, there are reasons for doing it and reasons for not doing it. And in the end, well, that's just a matter of taste, I suppose.
Oh, yeah, style and taste. Well, comic books and, well, maybe perhaps text and writing in general is all about style. And so, Christina, talking about linguistics, I think you at one point in time, you've actually done some linguistics research on comics.
Yeah, I did. That's a nice thing about linguistics, that it allows you to do research on the things that you love. And I love comics.
Yeah, and I think, well, at least until now, the research was only available in German. So what can you tell us about your research? What was the core focus? What were you looking at?
I was interested to see whether the language of comics is actually easier than the language that we find elsewhere. Because if you think about, those critical attitudes towards comics in Germany in the past, it was mainly about comics being too simplistic in their language and using onomatopoeia and things like that. And so I was just wondering whether this potential simplicity could be exploited as a means of studying languages more easily. And so what I tried to do is actually find out if the language in comics is easier.
Well, that certainly seems like a good research question to me, right? Because while if you think comic books are for children, then you would assume they use simplified language. But of course, those of us who enjoy comics know that some of them can be quite mature and tell quite mature stories. So what did you look for? How did you evaluate this?
What I tried to do is I tried to compile a little corpus, a collection of texts from comics, but that was very special because usually when you collect material from different types of text, you just basically copy paste text into a document. But that was not possible there because I first had to find out in what forms language occurs in comics, what I will accept, what I will integrate and what not. And then I had to type that all manually into a document. And that was a lot of work. So that corpus isn't terribly long, but I still tried to kind of make it as representative as possible.
So how did you go about making it balanced? That sounds kind of challenging.
Yeah, it is. So what I did is I tried to see what kind of texts inside the world of comics I wanted to integrate. So I wanted to have popular comics that are very famous. So I decided to go for superhero comics.
Okay, I like that.
So I used some Batman comics and Superman comics. But I also wanted to include Disney comics, which I feel are very important as part of the English-speaking comic world. And since I really love comic strips, I also wanted to include some Calvin and Hobbes and some Peanuts because they have been running for such a long time. And in addition, I thought it would be interesting to also include some cartoons. So even if cartoons just consist of a single image, by contrast to comics, which are sequential, which means that you have various panels, one after another. Well, I still thought that there's enough similarity here to the other types of comic. And I also included The Far Side. I don't know if you know that.
I do.
Oh.
And actually, the Peanuts have a very, very special place in my heart because my hometown in California is actually where Charles Schulz lived, the author, the creator of the Peanuts. It has a very strong association with him. His family is there. There's a museum there. And all around my home county, you can find statues of the various Peanuts characters and you can take pictures with them. So we even have an ice rink called like Snoopy's Home Ice, and it's all decorated with Snoopy. And I think it's actually owned and funded by the Schultz family. So yeah, I'm happy to see the Peanuts represented here.
Oh, that's wonderful. I didn't know that. Fantastic. Yeah. So I thought they should definitely be in there. But of course, when you make a corpus, you try to select those particular bits of text that you use by chance. So for the Peanuts, I thought it might be a good idea to use those strips from the 1st of January. But then I noticed that, if you do that, it's all the time about the new year. And since I wanted to have more varied topics, I decided to just select the 15th of January instead. And for the other comics, what I tried to do is to just pick those pages that ended in a 0, and then I just selected all the text from there.
Okay. So that's how you were able to kind of standardize this to kind of scientifically control it, essentially, for your evaluation here. Okay, very nice. So we've covered things like onomatopoeia, but what other ways does language occur in comics?
Yeah, there's many different ways how it can actually occur. So I think onomatopoeia are so important because they stand out. But otherwise, of course, you have the speech bubbles, or speech balloons, as you might possibly call them, in which we have the dialogue of the different characters who are speaking in the comics. And then we usually also have some boxes that contain the narrative. So I would expect
you're right. If it's in a box, you're right. It's like narration outside of the story. You're right.
Exactly, and it's not something you would think of. So usually you would probably think of the onomatopoeia and the speech bubbles because that is so characteristic. But of course, there's also the narrative. And there's yet another type of language in the comics that we also integrated, and that is language in the environment. Because you might have writing on a shop window, for example, or you might have a newspaper with important news, or a name on a doorbell. And all of these, I also included that.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, and the speech bubble, the humble speech bubble, it's fascinating to me how this has become a convention that I would say is now universally understood. If you look at older comics, it seemed to me that if there was dialogue, essentially you would have the picture and then they would write the dialogue underneath the comic, almost like a caption. So I would think that the speech bubble originated in comic books or was at least popularized there. And also, that if the speech bubble looks maybe less rounded and more like kind of a poofy sort of cloud, then it probably represents a character's thoughts and not what they're saying out loud. So I love this stuff.
Yeah, me too. And it's wonderful because, of course, the thought bubble represents the thoughts. And sometimes you also get a speech bubble with icicles on it. And then it shows that someone is speaking a very cold voice, I love all these things, which are very visual. But of course, at the same time, that means that when I just typed the text into my corpus, it looked terribly boring because you just have the very, very plain text. And without the context, you notice, the comics, they really live from this interaction between the image and the word.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That the text and visuals really they kind of synthesize in a way that the sum of the parts are greater than the whole. And when you kind of abstract it and just pull the text from it, a lot of the meaning is lost. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes comics so similar to, the real world, because you also have the surroundings of the dialogue. And I think that's also what makes them easier for people to understand. But if you take all of that away and just look at the language, is the thing that remains, is that actually easier than what you find in other types of text?
Yeah.
So, the question is, how can you measure that? Yeah, so in linguistics, what we try to do is we try to find measures that can be used as a stand-in for something else. And if you think about how difficult a text is, of course, that could be due to the words that occur in it. So it could be that the words, for example, are very rare. And if they're very rare, they will usually be more difficult, because people who speak a language will usually tend to learn the more frequent words earlier.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, one way of looking at it. And of course, you can also look at how complex the structures in the language are. So, for example, the sentences. How long are the individual sentences? We can just try and find where we have full stops or periods and other punctuation marks like question marks, exclamation marks, and then just divide all the text into sentences and count how many words are in those sentences.
Yeah, that would certainly make sense to me. Well, especially because the language in comic books it's mostly dialogue, right? It's almost all dialogue, I would think. And dialogue, we speak in fragments. We don't speak perfectly grammatically correct. We don't have to. It's acceptable. And so if the entire narrative is told through dialogue, then I could understand how that would kind of change the form of the language that you're studying.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, in spoken language, we just expect the language to be less complex than, for example, an academic research article, simply because we have certain constraints on processing. When we talk, we have to memorize the things that or plan ahead what we're going to say. And of course, that's why spoken language is typically not as complicated. But beyond the sentence level, I mean, you can also just look at the word level and see how long the words are. You can just see, for example, what number of syllables they contain or how many letters they are composed of.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I saw a meme recently comparing English language children's comics to German language children's comics. And the German language comics had some very tremendously long words, which of course to non-German speakers looks very funny to us, because the longer the word, the more difficult we would assume it is to understand, especially for a young child.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, that actually the length and the frequency, they go hand in hand. So there are different studies that show exactly that. So if a word is very short, it's very likely to be easier and more frequent. And if it's long, it's likelier to be less frequent. And so that's why, what you can do is you can use things like the word length, which is something that is very straightforward. And then that also gives you already information about how commonly used a word is. And that's fantastic. So there are some formulae, some indices that you can use. So readability indices. And I just used one of these, the so-called SMOG index. And to that end, I just used the information that I got from my material, inserted it into the formula, and then checked, how difficult the language actually is. And the question is, what does the result mean? Because, of course, in the end, you get a certain number. And in that particular case, it means how many years of schooling you basically need to have in order to understand a text.
A reading level. Okay, yeah, wow, Christina. Yeah. So I understand what you were looking for, and I think I understand how you did it, how you measured it. What were your results? What did you find in the end?
Well, to some extent, I found the things that I expected. So the sentences in the comics were actually relatively short, so a bit over 6 words. But then, of course, you should consider that I also counted onomatopoeia, and these are usually outside a sentence. So a WHAM just occurs on its own, and that will count as a single word sentence. So, of course, that actually reduces the figures. most of the sentences have up to 8 words or a bit shorter than that, but there are also some very, very long ones. So I actually found a number of sentences that had between 16 and 19 words, and one with 38 words in Batman, which was quite impressive.
Okay. I could imagine perhaps a villain or an antagonist going on a monologue, right, about their evil aims, perhaps.
That's actually the thing, that very often it's the villains that use more formal language and more complicated sentences. Lex Luthor in particular in Superman. So he said something about that Superman's carelessness with his special abilities has resulted in the clearance of almost every bank vault in the city and the hospitalization of half the special crimes unit, which is really a lot to process, you know? It's not something you would naturally say in a dialogue. So that really characterizes him.
Oh, so speaking in an advanced manner makes you sound evil?
Probably I shouldn't say that. No, but sometimes this is used as a characterizing means in certain types of film, actually. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, certainly makes sense to me. Wow, Christina, that is really cool. This is really cool research. I like this.
Yeah, and I also found that if you look at the text, how difficult the texts as such are, then you find that they are not very difficult. They are at level 6, which counts as low literate. So the Disney comics in particular, they were relatively low regarding the level, which means that they're very easy to understand. And Superman was very clearly above the others, which kind of is very fitting, you know, because Superman can also fly. So you have almost 9. And it's very close to the kind of level that you would be expected to have to read Reader's Digest.
Okay. Yeah, and that would be in line with I would assume that Disney comics are probably targeting a younger audience than maybe superhero comics, right? Sometimes some very dark things happen in superhero comics, so you probably want to have maybe a teenage or a young adult audience. So that certainly makes sense to me.
Yeah, I entirely agree. That's what you would expect, and that's also what I found. But on the other hand, I was also surprised because I really like The Far Side by Gary Larson, and I think it's sometimes quite difficult. For example, there's one about a bird on the phone telling the children, "Will you kids shut up? I'll regurgitate something later." And I mean, that's really complicated. I mean, it's hard vocabulary. So I thought, okay, for that reason, it might be that these are more difficult to understand. But then the academic vocabulary that you occasionally encounter there is counterbalanced by the surrounding words and the short sentences. So in the end, it's not as difficult as I had expected. So I was also surprised by my results.
And that's the best type of research to do, right? That's the best. It's great to be surprised by your results.
Yeah. And one other thing that, well, I'm not sure if it surprised me or not, but I also wanted to check how common onomatopoeia actually are, because a lot of talk about comics revolves around onomatopoeia. And so I actually annotated these in my corpus, and I found that only about 3 to 4% of the words in the comics were onomatopoeia. But people still sometimes believe there's a lot more. And that's probably because they are rare elsewhere, you know, and they're also very characteristic, and they stand out visually. So with a special form, with a special shape, with color, etc.
Yeah, no, that certainly makes sense to me, that because onomatopoeia are so characteristic of comic books, you might get, from the outside, you might get the false impression that it comprises a great deal of the text in comic books. And then, yes, from the outside, you might think that certainly the language of comic books must not be very intellectual. But in reality, it's only a very small percentage.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's the nice thing about it. And it also means that the other things that you find there will mainly be dialogue and a bit of narrative. So I think that for that reason, comics can be strongly recommended to learners of a language, because they've got everything that you need in order to learn new vocabulary. You've got the context that is provided by the image. You have relatively short sentences most of the time. And, quite a lot of the words are also high-frequency words like elsewhere. Not all of them, actually less than I expected, but still, I would say that altogether, if you look at the language of comics, it's comparatively easy. And for that reason, it's always a good idea to read comics when you're learning a language.
Oh yeah, I've bought before a bilingual manga, English-Japanese bilingual manga, where it has the dialogue, it has the text in both languages, specifically for learners, of course. So yeah, I agree. Not only is it a good way to learn, it's a fun way to learn languages.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Christina, over the course of our conversation here, something that's occurred to me is that, when we speak, language does not exist in isolation, right? It exists in the context of, the person's expressions, their tone, their volume, the environment. That's why it's kind of a problem in writing, that in writing there is no tone. So you can be misinterpreted if you're maybe trying to joke or you're trying to be sarcastic. Just plain text, plain writing looks very, very serious. And so we have to kind of add things to the writing to kind of convey tone and emotion, notably emoticons or emojis. Sort of emojis are kind of adding a visual back to the text, almost kind of like a comic in a way, right? It shows you that kind of that visuals and language really go hand in hand.
Yeah. I think emojis are very, very helpful because they can transmit those facial expressions or the intonation that usually comes with language and make it more difficult for people to misinterpret what you're saying, because otherwise something that is meant as a joke might come across as very harsh.
Yeah, and much like comic books, I think emojis were once regarded as quite juvenile, but I think they're becoming increasingly acceptable. I see them all over LinkedIn, for example, which is a social media platform, but it's supposed to be kind of a more serious one. Although I think it'll be a long time before we see emojis in a scientific paper or in a newspaper article.
Yeah, but you do see them in linguistics papers because there's actually linguistics research about emoji.
Oh, nice. Yes, and some people have joked that emojis are the new hieroglyphics, but actually hieroglyphics are highly relevant to comics because in a way they were kind of one of the first kind of visual representations of kind of actions and language.
I think I need to contradict you there, Dominic, because what about cave paintings?
Oh, yeah, you got me there. Cave paintings definitely are an extremely early representation, a visual representation of action. But I would think the hieroglyphics were more of kind of a standardized writing system.
Yeah, I suppose I can agree to that.
Yeah, but it's fascinating the way these things differ across different regions of the world, different areas. I mean, like I told you, when it comes to Europe, for example, European comics, pretty much a gap in my knowledge, aside from Asterix and Tintin, maybe, really a gap in my knowledge. So I'm going to try to see if I can read some more German comics while I'm here in Germany.
That's definitely a good idea. You could probably try Nicht lustig by Joscha Sauer, even though that's more of a cartoon, but it's very nice black humor, but in a child-friendly way, I would argue.
Dark humor in a child-friendly way. Interesting. I would think that's a contradiction in terms. Okay, very, very German. Yeah. Very German, it sounds.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about like comics, somehow we kind of also made Disney comics our own in a certain way, thanks to a very, very influential person called Erika Fuchs. So she was the translator of the Karl Barks Disney comics into German. And there's even a museum that was actually set up to her memory, the Museum for Comics and Language Art in Schwarzenbach an der Saale. And there you can get an idea of, the very important contribution that she made to making those comics available to a German-speaking audience. But at the same time, she also influenced the German language.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I know nothing about this. Can you tell me more?
Yeah, so if you think about the German language, then, for example, the infinitive usually ends in en.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you have seufzen, which means to sigh, in the end, the en marks the infinitive. But in the comics, actually, Erika Fuchs, she used the form without the ending. So seufz, which means sigh, as you would see it in a comic. And this is called the inflective, or sometimes also the erikativ, to her memory, because this is something that was new, or in any case, which is very strongly associated with her, because thanks to her translations, this is something that became standard in German comic language.
Yeah. Wow. That is a direct impact on the language, and it reverberated kind of throughout the rest of the German language.
Well, I would say that whenever you want to speak like in a comic, then you would just do that. But otherwise, you don't use them. And that's the thing. So it's very characteristic of comic
German
language.
Comics. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, so in that sense, it kind of had an impact on the register of comics in German. And she is also the person who's responsible for the names that we use in German when we talk about the Disney characters. For example, Donald Duck stays the same, but Scrooge McDuck is called Onkel Dagobert. So Uncle Dagobert, which is a name.
Quite different.
Yeah. And for example, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, Donald's nephews, they're called Tick, Trick, and Track in German. Completely different.
All right.
And the interesting thing is that she did a wonderful job because she also used different language to characterize the different persons in the comics. So Huey, Dewey, and Louie in German, they also use youth language, for example, the youth language of the respective time. Or, for example, Uncle Scrooge, he uses very elaborate language. And it's quite interesting that actually, in contrast to what those critics argued in the past, she included a lot of quotes from traditional German poetry, from international classics, etc. So there's actually a lot of allusions which you that you can find in the language of the comics. So that way you can actually learn something about culture in all its respects, also from a linguistic perspective, by reading the translations by Erika Fuchs and the people who came after her and did things in her tradition.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. This is all new to me. Thanks, Christina. I have to check this out. It sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. And another thing, by the way, that she also did is she sometimes Germanized things. So she wasn't so keen at translating American cultural habits. And for example, in the museum, you will find that there's one panel where they say something like, bring us a lot of hamburgers and hot dogs. And she translates that as sausages into German, because that's the thing that you would have in Germany.
Yeah, localization, a very critical part of translation, I would say. If you translate without localizing, it might not necessarily be as effective. Yeah, totally.
Absolutely,
For example, at least the leading example I can think of is that in Japan they have this animal called a tanuki, and you could call it a raccoon dog. It's more like a dog or a fox, but it has fur that looks like a raccoon. And so often when that's localized into English, they just call it a raccoon because English speakers wouldn't know what this animal is because it doesn't exist in the English-speaking countries. But of course, it's kind of wrong to call it a raccoon. It's not a raccoon. It's a completely different animal. It's kind of more like a canine type animal. So, but that's kind of part of the localization. That's you want to make the translation effective. You don't want to confuse the readers.
Exactly. And at the time, you might have confused them by mentioning things like donuts, for example, which were not so commonly known. And now, of course, it's different with globalization, with the internet. You know a lot more about other cultures. But at the time, of course, I think it made more sense to have that localization. And that's why Duckburg is also called Entenhausen, for example.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Very nice. Well, Christina, today's conversation was really, really fun. I enjoyed it a lot. I think we did a good job of covering a really wide range of topics when it comes to comics and language. So yeah, this was awesome.
Yeah, I also had so much fun. And there's more to come because I carried out even more research on comics. So everyone out there, stay tuned, stay curious, have fun with language.
And join us next time on Linguistics Behind the Scenes.